There's no sign from our politicians that they want to do anything about reforms. Governor Pritzker says reform of pensions is a fantasy, that it will never happen, it'll never pass legal muster, so he ignores it. We've got some Republican candidates that are ignoring pension reform for governor, Republican candidates for governor. They're saying, let's just grow our way out of it. And it's silly. It's silly. You can't grow your way out of a mess like this.
I'm Ashley McFarland, a nonprofit executive living in Duluth, Minnesota, and you are listening to the Vance podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, we talk to a very interesting guy. Ted Dabrowski is a former currency trader with Citibank who lived in Mexico and Poland. He's a child of immigrants, and he is in the state of Illinois doing what I think could be described as Don Quixote's work to try and root out corruption and the horrible problems that Illinois government is contributing towards, which is making people flee the state and leaves me sitting over here in the state of Missouri just hoping and praying that they will sell us Cahokia Mounds. This is a fun conversation, and it was one of those that was suggested to me by a former podcast guest that you're probably familiar with, a guy named Jeremy Lacoche, who has become one of my favorite guests to have on the podcast and a member of the Articulate Ventures Network. So in that network, we always have people saying, hey, I really think this might be a good fit for you. And boy, Jeremy was right. I absolutely love talking with Ted. You'll hear in this conversation, we talk about what is the problem with the state of Illinois? Why should other people in other parts of the country care about this? Because so goes Illinois. So grows the rest of the world. And then we have a relatively intense conversation about what happens when the money's buying power runs out, and what happens in a system when you have so much corruption that the only way to see it get out is some form of a revolution, which were my words, but definitely not his. He is a very balanced and interesting guy, and I think you're going to enjoy this. If you are interested in some of the things that we're doing either in the Articulate Ventures Network or you're interested in some of the classes that we're producing, I hope you'll sign up for our newsletter. This month, I am coming out with a class on introductions, which is how do you introduce yourself in a way that makes people interested in what you have to say, makes them understand what it is that you do for work, and prompts them to come up and start the kind of conversations with you that are fun and enjoyable and easy. So this is a class that we developed inside of the Articulate Ventures Network. And if you don't want to join the network, well, you can always just buy the class. And the way you can get on that mailing list is going to vancecrow.com/podcasts and sign up for our newsletter, where when we publish the course, this one on introductions, and in a few weeks, one on negotiations, we'll be happy to send you that notice. So we're going to get to this interview with my new friend, Ted Dabrowski. Ted Dabrowski, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on, Vance.
You come highly recommended from probably one of the most popular podcast guests I've ever had, a man named Jeremy Lacoche, who is hyper-focused on governance and the state of Illinois and what's going on in the state. And Jeremy is often says that, what's going on in Illinois is just the bellwether for what's going to happen in other places. So he said, if you want to know what's going on, you really ought to sit down and talk with Ted. So if you were going to talk with a person that had no idea the economic situation of the state of Illinois, what would be your kind of short rundown of it?
Well, my short rundown would be, my parents were both immigrants to Illinois back in the late 50s. My dad came from Poland. He escaped, communist Poland, risked his life to get here. And where did he choose to go? Illinois, Chicago. My mom was a 19-year-old Ecuadorian and, wasn't sure what she was going to do with her life, but she came up to America, had a brother up here. And, this is where she ended up finding her future, her freedom, the American dream. She was 19 and just came to Chicago. And so my parents met, and, they had 3 children and they lived the American dream in the way that it's defined. And life wasn't easy for them, but they knew how to grit it out in Illinois. And their story was the same story that was happening for millions of people. They were coming from all over the world to come to Illinois. And also the great migration from the South, and people came to Illinois for work. And so that was then. Today, we are the state that's shrinking the most in the country. People are fleeing Illinois like no other state. We compete with New York on that, but we've shrunk more than any other state since 2010 in the last decade. And people can't find their opportunity here. So they're fleeing to go to Texas, to Florida, to Indiana, Wisconsin, wherever they can go. And it tells you a sad state about what's happened in Illinois. It's a governance issue. It's a policy issue. It's a cultural issue, a political culture issue. And it's destroying the lives of people. It's destroying their home values. It's destroying their family values. And that's why people are leaving. And there's a few of us here fighting to take it back.
Well, so we live in a democracy. There are people that can vote for the policies. Why, if there are so many people streaming out of the state, doesn't a majority just get together and take back the state and do what they need to do to make it right?
Well, and that's the right question. I think what's happened is it's become so corrupt here. So, if you look at the political infrastructure, they own almost everything. They own the politics. The political
Who's
elite.
they?
It's a good question. It's what you might call the Chicago machine. You might call it the Illinois machine. It's both sides have owned the political infrastructure, and they're not for the democracy that you and I would understand. They're much more for machine politics. They control the media. They control the corporate elite, because the corporate elite doesn't want to ruffle feathers of the political elite. They control the judges. They control the maps. They control everything. And this is why I think what you see is you're seeing a lot of what would be the freedom fighters, if you want to call them that, in Illinois. They say, we can't win here, we're leaving. And that's why we've lost so many people. So I think we're losing the normal people who would vote against stuff because they're just voting with their feet rather than at the ballot.
So you said something, rather bold, like things like all the media is owned by this cabal of people. I grew up in Central Illinois. Are you saying that WEEK and, these WHOI, these are controlled by some mastermind group? Well,
you can't say I'm being, I'm painting with a broad brush, right? Obviously. No, there are some pockets of good media, but they're small. When you look at the majority of the media, right? And if you look at, of course, Facebook and everything else that's out there, they're controlling what people read every day. And so you do have good talk radio out there for sure. And, that's where we find our voice. And that's how we find, our listeners who listen to the stuff about the things on property taxes and pensions and things like that. But the overwhelming majority is owned. Let's take a step back. Most of the small media has been wiped out, right? Our newspapers across, small city newspapers gone. You might have a person now, rather than having a team that covers an issue and can open up a government document to find out what's happening with the budget or property taxes. They can't do that anymore because they're carrying a camera. If it's one person carrying a camera and trying to write the story, they're stretched. They have no idea what's happening in the finances. And this is why a group like Wirepoints survives and lives, is because we're replacing that. We're providing the data and the information that otherwise wouldn't be out there. But we have to battle the cancel culture that's out there, and it's powerful here.
So let's start right there. What is Wirepoints? I got a chance to check it out prior to the interview. It's a very interesting spot, one that's kind of rare. It is reminiscent a little bit of Drudge Report in the fact that you have so much on there and stuff that I don't normally see in other places. I mean that in a complimentary way. Yeah. What is Wirepoints?
So, it started a few years back. My partner, Mark Glennon, he was frustrated that the news wasn't being covered properly by any of the major media. And he started aggregating other news that other people had written that actually told the truth, or at least told partial truth. And he started aggregating news. Then he got more frustrated, and he said he started writing some pieces to try to tell the truth about what was happening. I was working at another group, and we decided to hook up and say, hey, we got to tell the truth. We're not political. We think both sides are complicit in the failure in Illinois. It's been a big joint venture between Republicans and Democrats. And so we got together and we started writing and providing the data. I'm a pretty data obsessed guy. And so if we make a claim, we want to make sure that the data is right behind it so people can see why we're saying it and what we're saying, and they can, take us on, which is, we want a good, healthy debate. But I think a key differentiating feature, in addition to the data, is we're going to tell it just like it is. We're not worried about whether we upset a Republican or a Democrat. We don't care. What we want to do is make sure that people understand what the truth is. And that COVID allowed us to really kind of show off our work, because it allowed us to grab the data and say, the government's not telling you this. Here's what you should know.
So give me an example. What did you guys uncover that the government was saying one thing and you guys discovered something else?
Well, right off the bat, we started, the whole notion in Illinois was that our government was going to be run by the Governor Pritzker, with executive orders. And, and of course, the fear in Illinois was that is all about cases. You only heard about cases. You never heard about deaths and hospitalizations. Or I should say differently, they use cases to scare you and invoke fear. And so we started saying we didn't even report cases on Wirepoints. We created our own alternative data using government data and started reporting it, but showing it in a way that we thought was the way you should see it. And we led with hospitalizations and we led with deaths. And we didn't even include cases in our data for a long time because we said that was not the right kind of data. And, wow, people loved it. Our volumes just went through the roof. Then we challenged Governor Pritzker why he wasn't publishing antibody data. This was data that other states had started to publish, and the government wouldn't publish it. Then we took them on other data, like why aren't they showing they actually weren't reporting hospitalizations, they weren't reporting several pieces of data. We challenged them. We FOIA'd for it. We started reporting the data, which forced the government to then report the data. So, people were just happy to see that there was an alternate site that said, wait a minute, think about it this way. And of course, that led us into talking about school openings and all that, which, people really appreciated the data we put out.
And what was your data telling people that they didn't understand prior to having that data? Well,
let's take the example of Chicago Public Schools, right? Massive school system, shut down March of last year and did not reopen until just a few weeks ago. So basically you had something that's, 80-something% minority, right? So here you have a class of children who are already massively behind with learning gaps, huge learning gaps, which mean in the future, huge earning gaps, right? When they're older, they're being kept out of school. And a big part of that was the fear that was being invoked about COVID. And, a few months ago, we took the data and we showed the number of kids that were under the age of 18 that had died in Chicago from COVID. And I can't remember the numbers now because it's at the time, but it's either 2 kids or 4 kids under the age of 18 that had died of COVID. And then we showed the number of kids that had died from under the age of 18 from gunshots. And it was something like 50. And later became 90. It became 8 deaths of COVID versus 90 deaths, or 100 deaths is actually 100 deaths from gunshots. We said there's much more risk of the kids not being in the classroom and being out in the streets. Let's get them back into the classroom. And that's the kind of stuff, right? You got to show the numbers and put some perspective on it.
So, I mean, that is one of those things that's jarring to the point of like a dark dystopia, right? That's like, who on earth would have first guessed that? And then 2, how did people respond as you put that out there? Certainly your viewers started to like it, but then you start putting that up in front of people and making them look at what they're doing. Did that impact them?
Well, it was hard to impact Chicago. It's such a big place and it's so politicized. But yeah, it had an impact. And I think, we're always breaking the narrative, the narrative that the governors always wanted to use, which is, shut down, lockdowns. I think we had much more impact in the suburbs because, there you had, and you're talking about the Chicago suburbs where you have wealthy school districts, including where I am. They didn't want to open up, but they didn't want to open up much. And so we started showing all the data of, well, let's look at the people 50 and under who have died from COVID. And if they didn't have comorbidities, it was a teeny number. And so these unions, the teachers' unions, were using their huge power to keep schools closed. And we just kept hammering the data. No children are dying. The number of teachers who might be under the age of 50 is a very small number. And then we also showed, well, don't forget, a majority of teachers, like 77% of the teachers in the school district I'm at, are under the age of 50. You can be in the classroom. You can manage this. And of course, you start showing data on the private schools who are open all the time. And they weren't having, there's no transmission. So we started reporting on the lack of transmission, all those things. If you report the facts and the data and present them in a fair, honest, and in a non-hyperbolic way, it can go a long way to changing minds and getting buy-in. And I think we had a big impact on getting schools open in the suburbs.
How did people find out about Wirepoints? One of the interesting things that I think COVID and the latest election have shown is that there are certain perspectives that even if all they're doing is showing, hey, this is data, hey, this is us going to a physical location where they said there were voters coming from and now they're not here, those people are getting booted off of social media, and I would guess probably throttled pretty significantly prior to that. So how in the world did you find an audience?
Well, I say one of the things we've done, and I think it's a sad part of our, what do you want to call it, battles in the culture battle we're having, is that I think we can win the arguments based on the facts and logic and reason. And I'm highly against the hyperbolic name calling, all that. I don't like any of that. So we really avoid it, because once you do that, then you're just like everybody else, right? And so we're direct. We're certainly direct. We certainly mean what we say and say what we mean, but we don't do it in a way that tries to put you down or calls you stupid. We're just putting the facts out there. And you can, if you have good data behind you, at least you can have a decent discussion, right? You can disagree on the data some and all that, but we just, we were a small team through COVID. We had 3 people and we worked our butts off, but we're good at taking the data. We're good at describing it, and we worked hard to just get it out into Facebook and Twitter, and it's hard work. We didn't spend any money to promote it. We just tried our best to get it out there. But I think people liked it, and so far so good.
One of the big things that we've had other guests on the podcast talk about, the pension problem in the state of Illinois. And it's not so much it was basically like making promises for the future, which was how they bargained for things, which then ended up making Illinois, a slave to the amount of debt that was mounting. What is it that people should understand about how the pension situation has crippled the state of Illinois?
It's a complex discussion. Most of the time when you talk about pensions, people's eyes glaze over because it's just boring. It's it's retirement stuff. But at the root of it is we got so many promises our government has made, and we'll come back to that as to how you get there. You got a government that makes so many promises to the public sector, which is the same public sector that's then, as I mentioned, the control of government. The unions support the government supports the unions. You got this great back scratching going on in Illinois that maybe you find similar competition for that kind of behavior in New Jersey or maybe Louisiana or something. But it's a legally corrupt system. Everything that's done is legal. It is highly corrupt. And so what's happened is you've got this massive amount of debts, and they have destroyed, I would argue they have destroyed the future of Illinois. There's very little time to figure out how to get around all this debt that we have. And what that means is that, think about it, when you have debt, somebody's got to pay it off. Assuming that we can talk about the federal bailouts and all that, but assuming there's no federal bailout, then it's the ordinary people of Illinois who are on the hook for paying it back. The problem is the debt's gotten so large, and we've made the argument at Wirepoints, there's no way to fix Illinois without cutting that debt, either through bankruptcy or through some kind of reforms and negotiation with the unions or through some legal mechanism to cut those debts, because it's so much that to try to make people pay it off, unless you build a wall around Illinois, people will just continue to leave.
How much is it? When you say it's so much, help me understand that. Put it in perspective.
Yeah. So okay. There's Moody's rating agency. Everybody knows who that is. They rate Illinois. They add up all the pension debt. There's official numbers, right? The state puts out official numbers. Nobody believes them. They're too low. Moody's does its own calculation. And when you add up all the pension debts and retiree health insurance debts, which pensioners get, and you add them up for Chicago, for Cook County, for every local government in the state and the state level, it's about $420 billion. Now that's a big number, but it means nothing. $420 billion is about $90,000 a household. So imagine that you're living in Missouri and you're thinking about moving to Illinois. Well, if you move in, you're going to assume in some way $90,000 of additional taxes to pay down, not for current services, not for better roads, not for your schools, is to pay down simply the old pension debt for services already rendered. So it's $90,000 a household. Well, think about that. That's a massive number. And the number is actually worse than that. Why? Because at least a quarter of the population is in poverty, so they'll never pay into that $420 billion. So that means it's people like me and others who have means that will have to pay it. So that number, what is it? 150,000, 200,000 per household. People just won't pay it, not to a corrupt government that won't fix things, and that the numbers only grow. The numbers only grow every year. The debts are billions more than the year before, and yet the state says we always have balanced budgets. It's never true. So the way this plays out is that it's so much debt that people just flee it, and when people flee, it's the same amount of debt on fewer people, and so the number spirals up until. I don't know. Do we have to hit a Detroit? Do we have to hit a Puerto Rico where so many people leave and then the debt's so onerous that nobody can pay it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, you and I before the show talked about the Peter Thiel paradox, and my Peter Thiel paradox has been for a while, although it no longer works because people agree with me, is Missouri ought to just set a little money aside and wait for the state of Illinois to eventually crumble, and then we should buy Cahokia Mounds, which I think is a national, international treasure. And do you think it will get to that point that the state of Illinois will be forced to sell off important parts of it? Will that ever sell off land itself?
Well, so this is where it gets complex, and COVID changed the rules of the game for everything. All right, so here we had Illinois, the credit rating, first of all, was by all three rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch, one notch above junk. Now, no state has ever been rated junk, ever. Detroit, of course, is a great example of something that became junk, and it was there's a bunch of notches of different ratings, and Detroit became bankrupt and junk rated. Well, Chicago Public Schools today is rated lower than Detroit. So it's at a lower level of junk than Detroit. The city of Chicago is already junk rated, and the state, by all three rating agencies, is right at the verge of junk. So what happens, right? So we're already on a path to become junk rated, and there's no sign from our politicians that they want to do anything about reforms. Governor Pritzker says reform of pensions is a fantasy, that it will never happen. It'll never pass legal muster. So he ignores it. We've got some Republican candidates that are ignoring pension reform for governor, Republican candidates for governor. They're saying, let's just grow our way out of it. And it's silly. It's silly. You can't grow your way out of a mess like this. And so before COVID, there was a chance that things were going to get so bad that either the government would be forced to do reforms, or you just have chaos on the streets. And Milton Friedman always said, what you want to do is force bad actors to do the right thing. And I think that the trajectory that Illinois numbers were going, and the outmigration and all that, was going to force change. But then COVID came along, and it really did expose how bad Illinois was. Right at the beginning of COVID, we had our state senator, Don Harmon, right off the bat asked for a $42 billion bailout from the federal government before there's even discussion of federal money coming to states. So he proved that. The Chicago Mayor, Lori Lightfoot, she asked Governor Pritzker, she said, Governor Pritzker, will you assume, please, all of Chicago's pension debts? We can't pay them down. And Governor Pritzker had to say no, because if we, the state, assume those pension debts, we'll become junk rated. So you could see that the ability to do anything about this problem is disappearing. But then, of course, all these federal aid packages came along, and they have, in a way, bailed out, at least in the short term, Illinois from having to fix its problems. And the latest package that just came through, the $1.9 trillion, will give Illinois about $25 billion in total across all governments. And so, it's not enough money to make a difference, but it does buy the politicians 2 more years probably of time to kick the can. And so we're trying to figure out, where does Illinois go with all this money coming in? Will people like President Biden and others then try to federalize Illinois' debt? Will they try to keep trying to give it more and more money so that the problem goes away? The way we're printing money at the federal level means perhaps they'll try to do that. So it's a confusing time for us in terms of how we handle Illinois' problems.
Yeah, this actually brings, so just the other day we had what we call the circular firing squad in a network I run, which is this debate program where the goal is not necessarily to win, it's to figure out how to have good, vigorous debate among people on different principles. And we were talking about inflation. And one of the things that I find very striking there is, if you can print money infinitum without inflation, then why don't we just print all the money and get New York out of debt and get Illinois out of debt? And the people that are saying we don't have to worry about inflation don't seem to have a good answer for that. What do you think? Why, if people are saying the bigger thing that we have to worry about is deflation, can't we just print our way out of this?
I lived my world, my financial world, before I did this stuff that I'm doing now. I was with Citibank, and I was in Mexico trading emerging market currencies, and I ran treasury floors, and so we were always. And then I was in Poland for 9 years, and always in the markets. And if there's a truth you learn out there, is that you can get away with bad behavior for a long time, right? You can always get away with bad behavior. It happens. It doesn't matter what thing we're talking about. People can act bad. But eventually, eventually they pay a price. And so, I was in Mexico in 1994 when we had the tequila crisis. Most people won't remember that, but that's when Mexico was borrowing hard currency like crazy. People were lending it to them, and it was a big party because you got you got a huge interest if you lent money to Mexico. And as long as Mexico could pay you back, man, you were making tons of money. But everybody knew that one day Mexico would not be able to keep it going. There would be a massive deflation of the peso, and it happened. In 1994, it happened. And so I remember some lady who was a friend of mine had been investing in Mexico, and after the peso devalued and she lost a ton of money, she goes, but I was told that would never happen, right? Because she believed that the game would just go on forever, and it didn't. And eventually the IMF and Clinton came out and bailed out Mexico with $50 billion. My next job was in Poland in 1999. Right after I got there, Russia, had done the same thing. They borrowed so much money and then they couldn't pay it back. So eventually you pay the price. So you can try to print as much money as you want and try to get away with it, but when you print trillions and trillions and trillions, there's no free lunch, and that's a life lesson I've learned. In a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good adage to hold the idea that you don't get away with anything ever. You will always pay for your sins. Yeah. And it starts to try and keep you on the up and up. And during that inflation discussion, somebody brought up the point that the way that this plays out is one of the ways that it could play out is that people start all these projects because there's no end to the amount of money that people can promise that banks can put up. And then you start having so much money chase after goods like steel, where they're just not available. Like I heard the other day that steel prices in December went up 40%, and prior to that, in the ag barn building industry, the most they'd ever gone up in a single year was 8%. So you're talking about real prices going up, the value of the ability to be able to purchase these things. And what will happen is people will start these projects, get them a quarter of the way through, a half the way through, and then just not be able to get goods or not be able to afford the structural materials to finish building them. And then
you remind me of my days in Mexico, where you drive around and you see these unfinished buildings. For 25 years, there's this massive building right in the middle of Mexico City, and you can drive by and you can see right through it. They never finished it. And that's probably an example. And there were many examples of like that in Mexico, where you get market disruptions and things are left alone. But I think, Vance, an important point about all this too is, let me tell you about who always got screwed or who always suffered. In Mexico, when we had that big deval, the wealthy people always make out. They know how to figure it out. But the poor, the low income people, they get destroyed, right? They're not protected. And it'll be the same thing here, where we can print and have this inflation, but it's not real. It's not. It's fake, right? And, if you build an economy based on printed money, it's not real, and eventually, it's a house of cards and it comes down. It's always the little guy that gets hurt.
Yeah, it's that, what is it called? The cantilever effect, where the people closest to the money that are being printed, they do just fine. They take their turn at the trough and put it into equities or things that can float along with it. But the people that get the dollars last are the people that are left holding the bag. They have a bunch of worthless paper, and the other people have already grabbed the value out of it. And then you have a deepening crisis. And eventually the gap between the poor and the rich must be reconciled. And I think that's something you can go and look at, so many ancient texts all the way down to the Bible that say, like, if you go too far where the poor get too disassociated from where the wealthy are, eventually bad things happen.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It's a good point, an interesting point. But I do get into that discussion sometimes where, I don't think that the people getting wealthy, right? People getting wealthy through good ways and through innovation and through what do you want to call it? Just good growth in the economy. That's fine, and everybody participates in it. It's when we create a false economy where it no longer makes sense and people can't. This whole thing right now where we're printing money, giving people money not to work, right? Eventually they're incentivizing them not to work. All that stuff is setting us up for failure because people are losing their skills. There's plenty of things to talk about there. But yeah, what we don't want to do is create a false economy that then people are ticked off about because, payback is hell.
So one of the things, I have a few listeners that are owners of property. And they're renting their property out, in the form of apartments, and they have people that just don't have to pay, and there's no way to evict them, which seems to me to be the very foundation of private property, all the way down to John Locke, is if I choose to rent to you, you have to pay to me, and anybody that interferes with that is interfering with the foundational right of civilization, which is property. What are your thoughts on this eviction moratorium and then the CDC stepping in and saying, we agree, and it should go on nationally for months and months more? Yeah, so
here's where we get to Illinois in the next kind of comparison of things. I was in Florida last week, and I was there for a week on vacation, and you rapidly see the difference in two economies. One that's an open economy and tries to keep things going and try to do things the market way. The other is Illinois that shuts down. Stays shut down, keeps doing more lockdowns, and then because of that has to do more rent control or rent, or things like you're mentioning. And so therefore you get into a false economy again. And, I, the owner of a property, suddenly can't get paid, but I also can't, but the economy's not open so that people can have their jobs and make their payments. And then you have the government fill in the missing earnings with these, extra payments. Unemployment insurance and extra payments, and it becomes a wacko economy. It's not a real economy. And I as I mentioned, I spent 9 years in Poland. I got there in 1998, just not too many years after the wall came down. And we some people don't. Okay, people think of communism and whatever happened is something long time ago. No, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, just a few years back, I was in Poland where they were unwinding 50 years of economic destruction, 50 years of individual property and individual rights were destroyed. And Poland was working. It was an amazing time to be there because they were working to give back the powers to the individual. They're working hard to get laws that gave private property rights back to the people again. And here we are in Illinois and in many parts of the country doing the exact opposite. I mean, it could not be weirder that that was 20 years ago. I was doing the opposite of what we're doing now here in Illinois. It's fascinating, and and it won't work.
That really strikes me. Something I'd never thought to look into is I kind of have the short man's view of history because I always I knew that Russia and Poland had a communist revolution and then they brought them in, but I always thought it just was there. But I never really thought about how did communism get stacked on? What were the ways that it came on? And I would have to imagine that it has something to be like what it is right now, where people are like, no, this is still, a democratic capitalistic situation. Don't worry about it. These are just things we're doing in the short term. And then eventually you wake up and you've been lulled into this sense where so many things have changed that take it away from the private property system that you may call it a capitalist system, but in effect, it's communism.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, they'll even use the words of democracy to put on those bigger restrictions, right? So to have a better democracy, we need this, rent control or the, all these different things that are happening today. We've had in Illinois, and I don't know how it's been where you are. We've had Governor Pritzker run the state with some 70 something executive orders and 13 or 14 months straight of one man rule on how to run the economy. If you think about it, he's choosing how to run the economy, something that we've worked, hundreds of years on, or thousands of years, right, to figure out how do we determine how to get what kind of bread on a shelf, right, or how many loaves of bread on a shelf. The markets figure that out. And here you have Governor Pritzker deciding what to open, what not to open. And we've seen all the discrepancies, right? You're allowed to have this kind of store open, but not that kind of store. Things that don't make sense. And here we are, adding all kinds of decisions now and giving people more money based on this or that. And, it's bastardizing the economy and where we've been. And it's going to be hard to figure out how we unwind all this. Maybe it just becomes so mucked up that the unwind happens.
Yeah, I'm in the state of Missouri, and I had the Attorney General on, Eric Schmidt, and I really think that one of the powerful things about the state of Missouri is how decentralized power is. Eric really is responsible for making sure laws are adjudicated, and he's willing to take people to task if they don't do it. And you have these situations where the city of St. Louis is following different rules than the county, and the county is following different rules than the rest of the state. And for my principles, that's exactly the way that you want it. You want to have different groups. And if people in the city of St. Louis want to run their city that way, fine. But that way I can leave it without having to leave every part of my state behind. One of the thoughts that I had, you wrote an article about a guy in Florida that left kind of as this nomad to get out of Illinois. And while I was reading it, it dawned on me that the state of Florida, you know how there's always those articles that are like, a Florida man does X and it's this wild, crazy thing. I actually think that maybe for a long time we've been a little bit gaslighted about the state of Florida. I really took them to be kind of toothless hillbillies and a bunch of really wealthy people at the bottom, tip. But they do have an element of freedom there and a way of thinking about not having this sort of centralization of government that isn't going on in the rest of the country. And that might be why they're so openly mocked.
Yeah, I would say that, one of the lessons learned about Illinois, and if I could share that with the rest of the country, is, you don't want things centralized because, one size fits all come from the top. If it's good stuff, right, we love it. Collectively, if it's working, we love it. But, it just doesn't work that way because eventually, one guy comes along or a gal and their policies are upside down or they don't know what they're doing. And, we've got so many mandates. And you mentioned the gentleman you mentioned at the opening of the show. I think Illinois is kind of the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the country. Obama got elected president, right? He took a lot of the stuff and, I would say the Illinois politics and the Illinois machine. He took a lot of that with him. Rahm Emanuel was up there. They're experts at this stuff. And what it comes down to is, they know better than everybody else. And they love to centralize decision-making. And they want to take care of you. They're very paternalistic, and that's not the America that most people want. Maybe in the big cities that's come to be, but what we have is we have mandates on all the stuff we're talking about, pensions. It's all mandated at the top level. Cities can't really do anything to get themselves out of the mess, and so every city is becoming rotten because of the state mandates from the top. And it's not just the pensions, it's the collective bargaining laws, which I think are, watch out the rest of the country, because if Illinois' collective bargaining laws are spread everywhere, people will have no freedom because the unions will have all the powers, the public sector unions. And so your point was about Florida. So what's fascinating about Illinoisans is if you talk about, let me bring an example. He was a small city mayor. And he actually did some good things here in Illinois. He lowered some taxes. In Illinois, we only raise taxes. We never lower them. And so when this guy lowered taxes, he actually caught a lot of grief for it. And he decided finally to leave. And he chose to go to Alabama. And if you say that somebody moves to Alabama from Illinois, they're like good riddance. They think that Alabama, they have no schools, they have dirt roads only, and they just think very poorly of them. It's a really arrogant way to think. But if you know anything about Alabama, especially northern Alabama, it's booming. It's booming. Huge investments, billions of dollars of investments are going on, and people are saying, hey, I can buy a house, huge house, big property, maybe a swimming pool, and pay a quarter of the property taxes I pay in Illinois. I'm out of here. Same thing in Florida, right? It's a state that manages to grow much more. There's a lot more jobs. If you saw some of the data we posted in that piece, they far outperform Illinois on jobs. They far outperform people on attracting people, right? It's a growth state. Illinois is a shrinking state. And I think in Illinois, we're just so arrogant. We think that whoever leaves, good riddance, and we can do on our own. But it's a fool's thought.
A few months ago, the book club that we run in this network read 1984, which was like a really big splash for me. I had forgotten, I kind of, when I was in high school, read the book, and I didn't really realize that one of the major points in that book is the distinction between the inner party and the outer party, and how the outer party are the people that are doing all the censoring. They're the ones that are, a part of the whole machine that makes the whole thing work. And the reason that they do it is that they expect that one day they will be called up to be a part of the inner party. They will one day get into it. And as I think about how this is played out in the U.S., I think in a lot of ways, this is when we started to say students should take on massive amounts of debt to go to college. That was when we really started to accelerate this, because you start having this sort of elite candidates, right? They want to be a part of the elite, but they're actually just candidates for it. They've put themselves in the position to have the degree, to be a part of the thing, and now they're just waiting for their chance to get the step up, to be a part of the Clinton Global Initiative, to participate in the political machine, and that really it's just a way to keep the system perpetuating. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, you're hitting it head on, and it's what we see in Illinois all the time. And it's let me start with the political parties first. The Republicans used to be a party of power here, a long time ago in Illinois. But over time, I think their brand got, they started to take care of the unions as much as the Democrats did. And so there was a lack of differentiation between the two. But over time, Republicans, they're super minorities right now in both chambers. And so they hardly exist. And so I think so much of it has been that they wanted a seat at the table. They wanted to be part of the decision-making kind of thing. And so they've joined in on all the bad things. And so now it's kind of hard to tell the difference between them. And, they haven't figured out how to rebrand themselves as the reformers and the ones who are going to do things differently. So when it comes back to the broader thing, not just politics, but it's the same thing across school districts, across households, people, yeah, you feel like you have to keep wanting to be in the club. Well, in Illinois in particular, you figure, well, I can't beat them. So if I don't leave, I might as well join them. So how do I get my share of the spoils? Let me join one of these public sector unions. Let me get a gig. This is how the legal corruption has started. We've got the most units of government in the country. We have 7,000 different taxing bodies. That's far more, in number and in per capita than California or Texas or Florida. And what it does is it creates all these governments where people want to be a part of it so that you can participate in the spoils, whether it's a pension or some of the benefits. And that group becomes so big that it almost becomes like a huge voting block. And that voting block, especially in the small local elections, outnumbers the people who aren't paying attention. And then that's how we end up with the highest property taxes in the nation, which is what we've got. And we've got a situation where we just can't get ourselves out of this mess. And people are now shaking their heads and saying, what do we do?
Yeah, I don't think people realize that the largest employer in the United States is the federal government. And probably within each state, well, a state like Illinois, I imagine a huge percentage, more than any other single employer, is probably the state itself. Yeah.
They're a big source of jobs. And once you figure out the benefits, look, you can retire in your 50s, being a state worker, full pension in your 50s. Then you can go out and do some more work and pad that. And I just wrote about our superintendent from the area that I lived in. I was curious to know what was I doing? I was doing some pension research on the big pensioners. And when I was looking up his data, he's got I forget the numbers now, a couple 100,000 something pension a year. He'll get about 6.6 million in lifetime pension benefits if he lives to, be the normal age. And I found out that he had taken on a part-time job, a half-time job at another school district not far away. And he was teaming up with another retired pensioner. And they were half and half teammates to make up a full superintendent. But if you work 0.49 years, you can still work and get your pension. And so, it's double dipping. And so then I looked, I said, well, wait a minute. Well, I found out he did that last year and he did that the year before. And the guy that he's doing it with has been doing this for like 10 years. So they figure out how to get massive pensions and they continue working while they receive their pensions. And then we found a whole bunch of other people doing it. Then we found out that it's even bigger than that. And again, this is how you make things work in Illinois. And the sad part is that the little guy in East St. Louis or in Harvey or in Rockford who's working hard somewhere, paying his income taxes, part of his income taxes are going to pay for that superintendent who's double dipping. And that's how screwed up it is.
You've used a word several times. It's a very bold word, corruption. And it's actually one of the things that I studied in graduate school. How do you get rid of corruption? Particularly, I was focused on sub-Saharan Africa because I had lived in Kenya and saw that there is no possibility that those people will raise the bottom quarter of the population out of poverty until they get rid of corruption. And I became somewhat of a cynical person around corruption in that I think that there's very few ways to root it out without a full-scale revolution. Do you have a different opinion on that? Can you get rid of corruption without some massive upheaval?
Well, okay, so let me take you back to my Mexico experience. When I first got there, I lived in Mexico City. I was there about 6 years. And, as you're driving around, you will eventually get stopped by that little guy. He's on the corner. He's going to say, come here. When he asks you to come over and you're driving by, you pull over. Yeah, you don't keep going because you don't want that kind of problem. And, you invariably did something wrong, something small. And so you hand over 20 pesos. And that once you learn that that's part of the system, it's a system where you pay that guy, he pays off his bosses, and everybody enriches himself from that small level corruption, right? But it happens everywhere, and that's just how it works. Those are the rules of the game. Call it legal, call it illegal, call it what you want. I argue that in Illinois, that's why I use that word legal corruption. We've got a system similar to that where we have, as I mentioned, all the units of government. And they all know that once you get into that gig, it's good, but you got to protect it. So you got to vote for the right people, right? You got to vote for the right people who will promise to, if you vote for them, they will take care of your benefits either through higher cost of living adjustments, some form of another additional benefit. They'll grow programs. And so it's that group, and they become a huge voting bloc, and they become the distribution of information and talking points across the state. So it's a system that it's really hard to break, and it's powerful and wonderful when you look at it from a construction perspective. How do you build something like that? It takes a lot of time. Guys like Mike Madigan, if you've heard of him, state House Speaker for some 30, almost 40 years, and was in power for 50 years. It took a long time to build that, but okay, how do you break it? At Wirepoints, we're pushing for the reforms. We're laying out the reforms. We've laid out a massive pension reform plan that we think can make a huge difference if it's done sometime in the near future. We're talking a lot about the collective bargaining reforms that have to happen. We're not foolish to think they're not going to happen anytime soon, because the powers there are never going to take on those reforms because it would go against their own interest, right? It would be, they'd have to break their own corruption, their own legal corruption ring. So they're not going to do it. So our argument at Wirepoints is, look, unless something changes in some fortunate way, those changes are only going to happen when so many people have fled, and there's just no way out. That you have some kind of, I would call it revolution, right? But some kind of massive disruption, and only then can you change the laws that break a lot of this stuff. when people finally realize that the math doesn't work. And I give you the example of Poland. They were massively destroyed by the socialist and communistic policies that were in place. But Lech Walesa in 1980, so you're talking about 10 years before the wall came down, Solidarity movement smelled that the math didn't work. And so they started rising up a good 10 years before eventually it all crumbled. But they were wise enough to do the proper civil disobedience and start rising up against the math. And I think that's what groups like us and a few others are doing, who are speaking up now. It might take us 3, 5, 10 years, but this math isn't going to work. And then to your point, it's going to take, hopefully it's not some kind of revolution, but it's going to take something ugly to fix this place.
Yeah, and it's really difficult because you can't do it alone. So in Kenya, they have this thing called kitu kidogo, just give me a little something. And I was on a little transport bus one time, and they asked for everybody to hand over a little kitu kidogo, and I was like, well, I'm the white American, like I'm not going to pay it. Well, the army pulled me out of the van, and they were like, well, we're just going to hold the van here until, somebody pays it. And it ended up being that the other Kenyans wanted to get where they were going and really didn't want to be around the army. So they took up a collection and paid it. And now I look back and see how foolish I was, right? I had no business doing that. But the other lesson I saw there is, there is no way to stop the inertia alone. You must find a big enough block of people that are all going to say, we're not going to do this. Because without it, the machine itself of corruption goes on without you, just steamrolls you.
Well, yeah, that's what's fascinating about the whole cancel culture right now. In Illinois, we're in a big battle right now over a lot of the imposition of critical race theory. If you look at the laws, they're all including this equity lens, equity angle. The language is, steep in white supremacy, and so it's in everything. And like you say, wow, it's like, geez, can I really speak up against it? I don't. Some of us are saying, well, hang on, this critical race theory is not really the right way to go about trying to solve some of the race issues we have in this country. And actually, we think that critical race theory is actually making it worse. But gosh, if you say that alone, right, then you get canceled, you get abused. And what we're finally seeing is that people are getting together. I was on a radio show the other day, and we're talking about this. Get together with your neighbors, get together with a small group. It's harder to attack a group than it is, one person speaking up. And that's what it takes to take on this cancel culture that's going on. You've got to get together with other people. Again, do it with logic, do it with reason, do it with respect, not with hyperbole and name calling. But it can be done. But you're right. It's really hard to break.
Yeah, I now have kind of a little personal philosophy of, if I see somebody has been canceled or kicked off something, I immediately go read their source material. What is it that this person literally put out? Now, what are people saying about him? And I would say 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100, this is usually somebody saying something interesting. Every once in a while, you'll find somebody they're like, I would never advocate for you to be canceled, but I'm not going to go out of my way to find you. But, I found a guy named Jim Rutt this way. Jim Rutt is the former CEO of Network Solutions, and his Facebook group had been confused for being some sort of QAnon group on Facebook, and he'd been banned. Boom. And so luckily I have this heuristic of, if I find out somebody's been banned, I'm going to go read about them, and you discover all these interesting people. So in one respect, cancel culture is a hell of a sorting algorithm, because it tells you this person did something enough to make the eye of Sauron point at them. And so you might want to go look them up.
Sure. And, and speaking up helps, right? It emboldens other people to speak up. And I think that's where we are right now, where we've got to speak up and defend things that matter to us.
So we talked a little bit about my own Peter Thiel paradox, where I want the state of Illinois, who's not been a good steward, to sell the state of Missouri Cahokia Mounds. Do you have a Peter Thiel paradox, something that you believe that very few other people would agree with you on? And I mean extremely few people. Well,
I might as well lean into what we've been talking about is reforming Illinois. People think that, Ted, what the hell are you doing? Right? I mean, why don't you just do like everybody else, just leave? And And, I'm a stubborn guy, I guess. I do think that Illinois can be reformed. I don't know what it looks like and how long it takes and how ugly it has to be. The optimistic side of me says, at some point we're going to all just wake up and be smart and we'll fix it. But, I don't expect that. I expect that we have to kind of fall down, hurt ourselves, sadly, and then get back up and be stronger. But, I do get my motivation from what I saw in emerging markets where countries screw up all the time. And, the financial markets globally punish the hell out of countries that do stupid things. It's sad. But in many cases, they get back up. And in many cases, they're better. At least they're better for a while. The question is, can we put better institutions? If Illinois falls, and it will, can we create better institutions, or do we, just fix things for a while, but we're never a great state again? I think I'm optimistic. Think about Illinois, and I look a lot at a place like Poland, right? Illinois is in the middle of the country, much like Missouri. We've got great soil. We've got the lake. Fresh water is going to matter a lot at some point. We've got the great college institutions that compete with any in the country or the world. We've got O'Hare and the infrastructure that anybody would die to have, and we've got a great history of grit and success. And it's a little bit like Poland. And it's when you have those kind of assets, you've got a great base. And it's not like we're some weak, poor. We've got great companies here. So the potential is massive. I mean, there's no reason why we're not a top 5 state just booming on all cylinders if we wanted to be, right? If you took a Ron DeSantis type and stuck him in Illinois. Now, of course, how do you get a Ron DeSantis type in there in the first place? But that's a longer story. But this place could be amazing for people, amazing for poor, amazing for low income, amazing for immigrants, amazing for anybody. We just don't think that way right now. And how do we flip that switch? That's the big thing. But I argue with reforming pensions, changing these collective bargaining laws that give the unions all the power and the normal little guy no power. Flip that. You go a long way to having and then pro-growth strategies. Watch out, rest of the country. We're back, but we're far away from that moment right now. So so I'm alone. I'm alone with a few people.
Yeah, I would say that I think that is actually a perfectly acceptable Peter Thiel paradox, because as I hear you talking, you do sound in some way like Don Quixote, but at the same time, like nothing has ever been built that is truly important without having a rational optimist standing behind there saying, hey, it may not look good, but I'm going to keep pushing through. So if people wanted to support what you're doing, learn more about it, where should they go?
Well, so we're wirepoints.org. You'll find our website there, and you can read about what we do. And we're developing a lot of new data and a lot of things that we want to do going forward. And we're also on Facebook and Twitter at Wirepoints. And we'd love any support. We'd love follows. We have a daily newsletter where we aggregate news that we think you're not going to see unless you get it from us, because the traditional media is not going to show you some of these things. And our newsletter is a big way to start. And of course, we love support, because what we do is hard work, and it takes a lot of money to distribute and create. So we love that.
Well, thank you so much, Ted Dabrowski, for coming on and talking so candidly about your passion project.
Well, thank you, Vance, for having me on, and congrats on what you're doing.